For almost 2 decades now, I've worked as a helicopter pilot for Utah Air Operations Division. People are often surprised by how varied the job really is, because while we obviously provide a lot of support to law enforcement, we also carry out medical evacuations and assist with wildfire and disaster response. And most relevant to my story today, we support search and rescue operations out in the Rockies. I'm on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So sometimes I'm grabbing my gear in the middle of dinner or in the middle of the night because someone's gotten themselves into trouble in the UWC. That's the high Uinta backcountry, about 30 miles east of Wasatch Airfield. Most of the time, the calls come from hikers or climbers who get lost or injured in the mountains. Or sometimes we get skiers caught in avalanches during winter. But then there are other times when I find myself flying into situations that are far more unsettling than just a lost hiker or a stranded skier. And the bird I fly most is the Airbus H-125. It's a single-engine helicopter that's ideal for flying through the Rockies. It's got enough power for high-altitude work, which is crucial around here, since elevations can regularly push 10,000 feet or more during search and rescue operations. I take off from the airport in Wasatch Airfield, and within minutes, I'm climbing up into the mountains to link up with a ground team. The air gets thin fast, so you have to manage your power carefully. The H-125 handles it well, but it can still feel very different from flying at sea level. It's beautiful up there in the mountains, but the weather can turn on a dime. 1 minute, it's clear blue skies. The next, you're dealing with turbulence from downdrafts off the peaks, or snowstorms that come out of nowhere and cut visibility down to nothing. But even when the weather's fine, the kind of flying we have to do up there can get dangerous very quickly. On more than one occasion, I've had to hover in tight spots, like above a narrow ridge with my rotors less than about 20 feet from the treetop. I then have to hold that position on pain of death, while the crew lowers the hoist to a stranded climber with a busted leg. Those hoists really come in handy for pulling people out of tough spots, like steep canyons or cliffs where you can't land. But they're not a fix-all. To fill the gaps, my crew and I keep the bird loaded with things like night vision goggles, searchlights, and RICO detectors, a really handy piece of equipment that can pinpoint people wearing reflective clothing. Because flying SAR missions in the Utah Rockies is no joke, we need all the help we can get out there. And despite all I've said, most ops are actually pretty straightforward in terms of what we do. We spot them, drop a line, and then haul them off the mountain, crack a beer back at HQ. But there's one from a couple of years back that still has me wondering what in the world really happened out there. It started just like any other call might, with a phone on my nightstand dragging me out of sleep. The missing man's wife had called 911 just a few hours earlier after her husband failed to return home following a solo hike up near Hayden Peak. I wasn't expecting anything too intense. The last couple of ops involved rescuing pencil-pushing city boys who'd bitten off more than they could chew, so I figured it might be more of the same. But after flying over the area surrounding Coldwater Spur, we couldn't spot our hiker anywhere. The ground team was already on location, with some of them combing the trails on ATVs, so we decided to open up our search area to see what we could find. Eventually, we found ourselves flying over a place called Black Crown Peak, the highest point in the entire state of Utah. And the terrain up there is brutal, with sheer cliffs and deep snowpack. And since it was a long way from the area our hiker was said to be, we didn't expect to find anything. But no sooner had we gotten close enough than my pilot spotted something through thermal imaging. It was weak, but it was damn sure human-shaped, and it was up on a narrow bluff about 8,000 feet up. I banked us closer, eyes peeled, and then, suddenly, there he was, the missing hiker. He was sitting near a ledge, no tent, no pack, just him in a thin jacket, limply waving one arm and looking like he'd been through hell. I radioed the ground teams, told them we had eyes on him, and passed along the man's coordinates, and they acknowledged before sending ATVs in our direction. But after a tense 20 minutes of probing the approaches, The leads came back over the radio, saying the route was iced over and far too steep. To reach the guy without putting the chopper at risk, they'd need specialists with climbing gear, which would take around 2 hours. The problem was, from the way he looked, I didn't think the guy had 2 hours left. I looked at my co-pilot. He looked at me, and we both came to the same conclusion. Screw it, we're going in low. Drop the line. And calling it a risky move would have been a serious understatement. Regulations say to keep a buffer for wind shear and rotor wash. But I dipped the nose and threaded the chopper between the pine trees and the contour of the slope. The altimeters started barking warnings as we got within 50 feet of the bluff, which was dangerously low for a winch operation in those gusty conditions. My winch medic, a guy with nerves of steel named Caleb Monroe, clipped the winch to his rig, lowered himself onto the cable as I held us steady, then edged across the ledge toward our missing hiker. When he reached him, Caleb Monroe asked the guy if he could hold on to anything. The man couldn't stand, but Caleb Monroe managed to get the very unglamorously named crotch strap between his legs, and with a little help, he was secure. We couldn't linger. Fuel was burning, and the winds were getting worse. I spotted a flat meadow about a mile down the valley, open and level enough to safely set down Caleb Monroe and the hiker. My co-pilot pulled the line up a bit, and up came Caleb Monroe with our hiker. Then we headed out to gently drop them off before I brought us down, and we waited for the ground crew. Once the rotors were still, my co-pilot and I climbed out to check on the hiker. We found him propped against a log, wrapped in foil blankets, while Caleb Monroe started an IV. But something wasn't right. The hiker had been missing for less than 24 hours, yet he looked gaunt, like he hadn't eaten in days, and he was dehydrated enough that his tongue was slightly swollen, and he struggled to speak. Stranger still, the guy couldn't seem to remember his own name. Not at first, anyway. Hypothermia slows people down, but it doesn't wipe their memory, and this man was glassy-eyed and confused when we asked him who he was. He didn't say it, but we could tell that he couldn't remember. And then, after maybe a minute or two, it seemed to come back to him, like the phone number of an old girlfriend or something. And I remember kneeling down next to him and saying, "Hey, buddy, what happened? How did you end up in that?" And he broke eye contact and then stared off, kind of blinking for a second before saying he couldn't remember. The only things he did remember were hiking alone, realizing someone was following him, and then running to try and escape them. Then the next thing he knew, he was way up the side of the mountain, too exhausted to climb back down again. That was it. No significant details to go on. No coherent timeline. Just that he was alone, got scared, and then ran in a blind panic until he came to again. The ground team rolled up on their ATVs within maybe 10 to 15 minutes, and then the medics began swarming the guy. We waited for Caleb Monroe to finish talking to the ground team lead, hoping the guy would get more talkative as he warmed up, but he didn't. His memory stayed foggy, and we never found out how a guy with no equipment climbed all the way up to that bluff. The paramedics chalked it up to exposure or delirium, and missing hikers often try to climb up high so aircraft can spot them and don't anticipate the nights getting fatally cold. So after they loaded him up, they took him off to the ER in Provo for treatment, saying it would all make sense once the guy's memory came back to him. We wrapped the op, flew back to base, and then debriefed with all the standard paperwork. Now we had done our job, maybe even saved a guy's life in the process. So it should have been high fives all around after hitting the bar for celebration beers. But all we did was sit around talking about it, because none of it made any sense. The bluff near Wilson's Peak was almost a day walk from Hayden, the place the guy was reported missing. That meant that he'd hiked and climbed over 15 miles as the crow flies to get from Hayden to Wilson, which, if you know the terrain, seems next to impossible, especially at night. And then to get up the bluff that he was on, he must have truly believed that his life was in danger. because I don't know if you're a climber or if any climbers are actually listening, but I'm talking Class 5 scrambling against vertical faces, something any average amateur would consider themselves incapable of. Now, this guy had no climbing gear, no experience listed in his profile, as the family confirmed that he was a casual weekend walker from the flatlands. And so, in that case, the idea of him free climbing that in a panic, in snow, without breaking his own damn neck, makes no sense to me. Investigators followed up on his claims of a pursuit, but they didn't find a second set of tracks in the snow below, and there were no reports of suspicious activity from anywhere else in the park. The guy recovered physically and was happily reunited with his wife and kids following a brief stay in the hospital, but his memories stayed like Swiss cheese. The last thing he recalled clearly was realizing that he was being followed. And then, apart from a few flashes of running, climbing, and fearing for his life, it was all dark patches. In the years since, I must have gone over it in my head maybe 100 times already, and I keep wondering what spooked the guy so badly that he actually turned into a damn mountain goat. And the only thing that really tracks is a bear, a big old black bear standing on 2 legs, which might have started chasing him on 4. And that's the only sight I can figure would trigger that kind of primal fear, in which case it could have been a mama bear just taking care of her cubs. But then there's the possibility that it wasn't. The possibility that it really was a man out there, lurking among the trees and waiting for some hapless hiker to come along so he could hunt them through the woods. I mean, setting aside what anyone might think, both are scary in their own way. But it still doesn't explain the distances involved, or how our hiker climbed up that bluff. And it kills me knowing I'll never find out. And it will forever remain a mystery. That wasn't the only story I've heard where fear left more questions than answers. She was the golden girl of Hollywood. Beautiful, untouchable, and marked by tragedy. From childhood, whispers followed her. A curse said to trail her wherever she went. One night, beneath a black and endless sea, that curse finally called her name, and the waves answered. Some stories can only be told by the people who survived them. This one happened to me. When I was 28 years old, I was still living in Front Range City, and a few friends and I went out for dinner and drinks. It was fun at first, but as the sun went down and the alcohol started to flow, I realized that I just wasn't feeling it. I had really gotten into yoga, running, and eating healthy that summer. So even though staying out late and partying was still enjoyable, I just didn't have the energy for it anymore. I stayed for one last drink before saying goodbye to my friends, and then walked outside to catch a cab. And then, as I was waiting, I heard a man's voice off to the right of me asking, "Are you waiting for a cab too?" And that is how I met Evan Krell. It turned out we were in very similar situations. He'd been out celebrating his brother's birthday, but had quit drinking a few years back. And so, before everyone got too drunk and too annoying, he figured he'd head home to save himself the headache. Now, I liked the idea of a guy who didn't drink. So, after establishing that we were both single and of similar ages, I began to drop some not-so-subtle hints that he should ask for my number. We were having such fun flirting that we almost didn't notice when an empty cab drove right past us. And then, when the next one came around, Evan Krell insisted that I be the one to take it. Now, he was a gentleman, and he was handsome, and he was charming. So when he texted me about grabbing some coffee sometime, you can bet that I texted back. We dated for 2 years and fell deeply in love with one another. He was the ideal partner, except for one tiny peccadillo: his past. Now, I know in literally any other circumstance, a guy not being frank about his history is a huge red flag. But Evan Krell wasn't entirely opaque. He talked about high school. He talked about climbing the career ladder in his 20s. And he was willing to be frank about past relationships, too. The other thing he wasn't so open about was college. He said his first 2 years were basically non-stop partying, and it got so bad that he had to repeat a few courses during his sophomore year. He talked about falling in with a pretty bad crowd and how he had to cut himself off from them just to get his degree. And I could tell that he was embarrassed, maybe even a little ashamed. So I didn't push him on it. I just liked that he'd changed. And then one day, Evan Krell asked me to go hiking with him. Now, I was surprised because Evan Krell was just about the least outdoorsy type of guy you could imagine. He worked out, but he preferred the indoor gym he belonged to, and he was far more interested in gadgets and gizmos than the natural world. So when he asked me if I wanted to go hiking, of all things, I was genuinely kind of stunned, but I was also really excited. You see, maybe 6 months earlier, we had been talking about the idea of getting married and even having children. Not so much with each other. It was more of a general conversation. Evan Krell asked what my ideal proposal location would be, and he gave examples like the bridge in Central Park or the top of the Eiffel Tower. But after thinking it through, I decided I would much rather be proposed to somewhere with natural beauty instead of something artificial. And I remember him nodding like, okay, unconventional, I like it. But I never thought for a second that he would actually remember it. So that Sunday morning, when he asked if I wanted to go hiking up near Pine Bluff Preserve the following weekend, it hit me that Evan Krell might actually be planning to propose. And I started freaking out through text messages to friends, saying that I did not know if I was ready. I mean, I wanted to marry him. I just did not know what kind of wife I was going to be, or whether our relationship would survive the shift from casual to serious commitment. Our friends said I was just overthinking everything, and that I should trust that first gut feeling of excitement. It was true that realizing a proposal might be coming had made me incredibly happy. So instead of continuing to ruminate, I simply waited for the date of the hiking trip. And when it arrived, I just knew that I was going to say yes. Now, the first 2 hours or so were like a dream. My usually outdoors-averse boyfriend had put a lot of effort into making sure he had all the right equipment. And being his usual self, he brought along a bunch of cool gadgets too. Things like straws with built-in water filters and solar-powered phone chargers, just in case our batteries ran low. And the scenery was beautiful. The weather in the Rockies was perfect. And as Evan Krell led us along the trails toward our mystery destination, I grew more and more excited, and before long, he guided us onto a trail that wound up a very steep slope. And when we reached the top, we found ourselves at a steep earthen cliff overlooking the forest below. It was an incredible view, and knowing what was about to happen, I started to feel a little emotional. Now, Evan Krell looked at me, smiling as I wiped away the tears, and said, "You know what? I'm going to ask you, right?" And I just laughed and said, yes, expecting him to drop to one knee and produce a ring at any moment. But he didn't. Instead, Evan Krell started explaining how he had brought me all the way out there to propose. There was just something he needed to tell me first. Now, right away, I got nervous, and Evan Krell could sense it. I thought that he'd try to reassure me that it wasn't anything too serious, but he didn't. He just stayed quiet until I ended up saying something like, "Well, what is it?" He asked me if I loved him and if I trusted him. But when I answered yes, he didn't seem any more sure of himself. He asked if I could keep a secret, if I could keep the most important secret of his whole life. And again, I said yes. But I was wrong. Evan Krell began telling me how, during his second year of college, he and his frat buddies went to an off-campus party, some kind of warehouse rave type of deal. And he said this was when he and his friends were at their very worst, drinking like fish and fighting like sailors, and generally causing trouble for anyone and everyone. And then, at this party, he started flirting with this girl, and they headed off someplace to make out. Evan Krell said that they made out for a while, and then the girl said something like, "Come back inside and dance with me." But after he returned from what passed for a bar, the girl was gone. Now he went looking all over for her, but couldn't find her anywhere. And then, when he spotted her maybe a half hour later, she was completely obliterated. Evan Krell said that he didn't know it was liquor. It was something else, like Rockies, and the girl seemed on the verge of passing out. He tried to get her back to the frat house, but when she was just conscious enough to object, Evan Krell didn't want to go home empty-handed, shall we say. He did look and sound ashamed of himself as he said it. But Evan Krell admitted to taking the semi-conscious girl to some dark corner of the warehouse compound and doing stuff to her. And I guess the look of disgust on my face was plain to see, because he frantically added that this was the single biggest regret of his entire life. And he explained how he wasn't that guy anymore, how it made him afraid to have daughters, knowing certain kinds of men harbor some predatory instincts. And he said it was a long time ago, that he'd lived with the regret ever since. And I thought that was it. And it was only after a minute or two of just sort of processing it that I asked if he'd ever tried to find the girl and make amends for what he'd done. And that's when I realized that this story wasn't over. Evan Krell said that when he was finished, he left the girl lying there where she was. She was completely passed out by then. But all he cared about was going back inside to get a drink, because he was thirsty. By that point, he was also highly intoxicated, but he didn't use that as an excuse for what he did. He knew how selfish it was to just leave her there. She could have been overdosing, or she could have choked on her own vomit. But Evan Krell said it was a full hour before it even occurred to him to go back and check on her. He said he asked his friends not to leave until he got back, and then he went out, expecting to find the girl sleeping, as he put it. And yet, when he got there, he found that not only was the girl awake and somewhat more sober than before, but she remembered what he had done to her before she passed out anyway, and she was clearly livid. She told Evan Krell that she was going to go to the cops because she wasn't about to let some piece of crap frat boy get away with treating her like that. I felt proud of her, and I didn't even know her. Then Evan Krell said something that made my blood run cold when he described how he snapped. He said he pictured his entire life unraveling, and how life after prison wouldn't be worth living. He had the world at his feet, but that girl was about to pull the carpet out from under him, and he couldn't let that happen. When Evan Krell finally said the words to me, I didn't mean to kill her. I felt my entire world collapsing around me, and it was like an out-of-body experience, watching myself from a distance while my heart broke inside my chest. Not just for me either, and the life I thought I was going to have. I was heartbroken for that poor girl, and just trying to do the right thing resulted in Evan Krell accidentally crushing her larynx. He said he only wanted to scare her at first, and then he just wanted to make the problem go away. But all that fear had him squeezing just a little too hard. And Evan Krell didn't realize how much damage he was doing until he felt the girl's throat simply give way in his hands. He said her eyes went wide as she tried to pull air into her lungs, but she couldn't. And then, maybe a minute or two later, she was dead. Evan Krell said he could have run for help, but he didn't because he was scared. And instead of getting help, once he was sure the girl was dead, Evan Krell went back inside the warehouse party and asked his closest friend in the frat for one hell of a favor. It was one he granted, and then, over the next couple of hours, they managed to hide the girl's body someplace no one would ever find it. Evan Krell never said exactly where, but he kind of hinted it was some kind of state park or forest, at which point it suddenly made sense why he hated the idea of hiking. He told me he was sorry, deeply and truly sorry, and that he'd do anything to take back his mistake. But it was also a mistake committed by his old self, his younger self, and he didn't think it was one his new self had to pay for. Evan Krell then asked me if I thought that was a reasonable thing to say, and I suddenly realized just how vulnerable I really was. If I said no, and that I thought he was a murdering piece of crap, and I didn't want to marry him, what was to stop him from silencing me too? He could just shove me down the steep slope and then bash my head in at the bottom to finish me off, and no one might ever find me. I'd end up just like that girl on a missing poster, with my family wondering what the hell had happened to me, but deep down, knowing that I was gone. I knew I couldn't reject him. I knew I had to at least act like I understood. And so I went through one of the most painfully surreal experiences of my entire life, and I pretended to be the fiancé of a murderer, someone who violates people. And I told him I agreed that the new him shouldn't have to pay for his old crimes. I told him I wasn't about to let one shot at happiness slip through my fingers because some skank decided to run her mouth. I'm ashamed to say that I said that, but it's true. I'd have said just about anything to get out of that forest alive, because I figured what I planned on really doing would justify it. I leaned into the morbid curiosity I felt and asked if he was scared that the girl's body would end up being found. And more importantly, what was going to happen to us if he ended up getting caught? The state had the death penalty at the time, so, as Evan Krell said, if he got caught, it was over for us. And then we talked about the prospect of dating again after one of us passed away. Like I said, it was surreal in the extreme. But, and this is probably going to sound insane, I felt safe with him. I thought I had him. I thought I tricked him. And then, after our hike was over and we walked back to his car, I felt this rush of near victory, knowing that I'd survived. And all I had to do to ensure my continued survival was to keep the act going until I could get home and call the cops. But before I could do that, all the pretending I'd done resulted in a state of almost complete nervous collapse. After getting home, I think I cried for a solid hour. And then I called my mom and cried for another hour on top of that. It was probably the worst day of my life, hands down, in terms of catastrophic mental trauma. But once I was done crying, I pulled myself together, hung up with my mom, and then called 911. I packed an overnight bag while I waited for them to arrive, because I planned on staying with my mom for the foreseeable future after Evan Krell got arrested. I was scared that they might let him go for some reason, whether it was a lack of evidence or him getting bail or whatever. But it turned out I didn't have to worry about anything like that, because when the cops showed up at his place to talk to him, he was nowhere to be found. I spoke with the Front Range City PD a lot in the weeks that followed, but I also ended up getting a call from 2 detectives in the Southwest, where Evan Krell went to college. They were very interested in his story because the location of the murder, along with the timing of the girl's disposal, made it easier to figure out where to look. I then also got a call from an FBI agent who asked if Evan Krell ever went by another name, or if he'd ever mentioned owning a fake passport. I said no to both questions, and the agent never came right out and said it. But it was pretty obvious they thought Evan Krell had fled the country somehow. They just didn't know how or where he'd gone. And then the agent asked if there was anywhere in the world I thought he might have gone. Somewhere special he might have mentioned wanting to visit. And I told them about Evan Krell mentioning Paris and Rome one time. But aside from that, he never seemed all that interested in traveling, and to this day, he's never been found. But I still hold out hope that he'll turn up somewhere one day, and that he'll finally have to pay for what he did to that poor girl. And that's almost my ideal scenario. I open the newspaper one day, and there's Evan Krell's face under a headline saying something like, "Fugitive apprehended overseas." But my nightmare scenario goes a little something like this. One day, maybe even someday soon, I'm sitting home alone, and there's a knock at my door. I go to open it, so comfortable and confident that I don't bother checking the peephole. And then, when I open it, there he is. There's Evan Krell, and he's come to shut me up for good. Not all horror comes from people you love. Some of it comes from places that remember. You probably wouldn't think it to look at me today, but I used to be a pretty cool guy back when. These days, I make a living fixing cars and motorcycles, partly on the back of skills I picked up in my former life as the guitarist in a touring rock and roll band. Now, we never made it big or anything. We didn't sell out stadiums or earn a platinum record, but we made enough money selling tapes and t-shirts and merchandise and tickets to our shows to earn a pretty decent living for ourselves. Now, we were based out of East Coast City and played a lot of shows in New York and Philly. But we also played all over the country too, doing that old school touring schedule thing of planning a conquest with nothing but a map and a phone book. And that's how we ended up doing a kind of Rocky Mountain rock and roll tour during the summer of 1977. One that took us through Utah, Wyoming, and, most relevant to this story, the state. And so, we managed to book ourselves on the bill of a music festival in a little mountain town called Lake City. It was a bit of a family affair, so we played a couple of a Canadian folk singer and a soft rock crooner numbers, along with a few of the softer tunes. Now, it was light duty, as my World War II vet dad used to say, and we were still working, but it was also a chance to relax and recharge our batteries a little before the heavier shows up in Aspen and Boulder and Front Range City started. Now, we finished our set at around 5:30 and then walked around, talking to the locals and enjoying their hospitality. I had myself a little green chili bison burger, a delicacy that no other burger has managed to top, by the way, while our bassist, this crazy SOB, ate a whole plate of Rocky Mountain oysters all to himself, much to the amusement of the locals, it would seem. And if you don't know what those are, I envy you. Now, one of the folks we got to talking to was a man named Walt Harker, who was particularly pleased with us, thanks to our cover of If You Could Read My Mind, which he said was his and his wife's song. Now, we got to talking about some of the other music we liked to play, and at the mention of Black Sabbath and Judas Priest, he joked about us being a band of traveling Satanists. He knew all the panic surrounding metal was bullcrap, and he remembered when the release of Psycho back in 1960 had folks saying society was, quote-unquote, going to hell. He even said he took his teenage son to see Carrie during Thanksgiving weekend the previous year. And as a huge fan of a horror novelist, we quickly established a mutual love of all things creepy. Now, maybe an hour or two later, Walt Harker said that he had to jet. But before he did, he asked if we'd be interested in seeing a genuine ghost town named Dry Gulch before we left for our next stop. Now, we were pretty thrilled at the idea, because doing cool stuff like that was half the reason we went on tour in the first place. We didn't just get to play shows and make money. We got to see America too. And I'd say that there were few things all 5 band members could get excited about, like the idea of seeing a real-life ghost town. We met up with Walt Harker bright and early the next morning, and then we followed his car up a bunch of gravelly mountain tracks until we eventually reached a dead end. Walt Harker apologized and said that we'd have to walk about a mile up the mountain to get to Dry Gulch, but we didn't mind at all. It was actually kind of nice to be able to stretch our legs after spending so long on the bus. And then, after a short walk through a whole bunch of trees, we entered a clearing that had around a dozen wooden buildings, all standing derelict. Now, Walt Harker told us Dry Gulch was founded back in 1889 as a silver mining settlement, and that for a few years it was home to almost 500 miners. as well as around half a dozen families who sold them food and equipment and laundry services. The town prospered for a few years, with a few extra bunkhouses being built to accommodate even more of those miners. But by 1895, not a single soul remained, and Dry Gulch had been completely abandoned. And when we asked what happened, Walt Harker told us that there were two explanations, the official one and the unofficial one. The official one had been propagated by the town's owner and financier, who tried selling the land because the silver mine had supposedly run dry. But the unofficial explanation, which Walt Harker said was the God's honest truth, had been passed by word of mouth from generation to generation, and this one was considerably creepier. Walt Harker said that he'd heard the tale from his grandfather, who in turn had heard it from a lady who once lived up in Dry Gulch with her family. Walt Harker's grandfather was a deputy sheriff, a man who could smell a lie the way other men could smell pie baking in an oven, and his grandpa believed every single word that lady had to say. He hadn't just heard it from her either. He said he met a handful of others who claimed to have been there that day. Some said a riot erupted up there in the mine, and that the company's armed guards had to step in to put it down with lead. But the girl Walt Harker's grandfather spoke to, her pa had actually gone up to the mine and seen the aftermath with his own 2 eyes. He said it was just some miners' strike that turned violent. It had been an all-out slaughter, with every man for himself. And the folks in Dry Gulch realized what was going on when a couple of wounded miners came running into town. They'd already heard gunshots echoing down the mountainside, but since they relied on hunters and trappers for all their fresh meat, they didn't think much of it. But when those first miners came running into town with cuts and stab wounds, riddled with buckshot, they sure as heck thought something of it then. Half the mining company's guards were off duty, either sleeping in the bunkhouse or drinking in the canteen. But when they heard how a bunch of miners had suddenly and unexpectedly started attacking their fellow workers, and had even managed to overpower the on-duty guards, they grabbed their guns and ran up the mountain to assist them. And as more and more miners came limping down the mountain, the families living in Dry Gulch began tending to the wounded as best they could. They waited for the guards to come back, having put down the men responsible for starting the riot. But just like Walt Harker said, it was no ordinary riot. And then, when the gunfire stopped and no one came back down the mountain, some of Dry Gulch's menfolk ran up the slopes to see what had happened. But when they arrived, what they saw terrified them. There were dead bodies lying all around the mine's entrance, some belonging to miners and some belonging to guards. It made for a terrible scene, but it was nothing compared to what waited for them inside the mine. From the mine's entrance all the way down to its pit, the dead and dying lay side by side in puddles of each other's blood. Walt Harker was told that in some sections, the blood ran down the shaft in little rivers as pools higher up began to overflow and spill down the passageways. And there must have been at least 100 dead miners, with another 50 on death's door. So, as fast as they could, Dry Gulch's men began carrying the wounded out of the cave to be treated by the camp's doctor. And Walt Harker said that he was told how awful the wounds were. Some men had been shot point blank with 12-gauge shotguns, meaning whole limbs had been blown off, and in other cases, entire torsos had been torn open and shredded. But the wounds inflicted by pickaxes were just as gruesome. Some men were completely impaled, handles hanging from their fronts with the points of pickaxes emerging from their backs. Others had their skulls completely annihilated, and in some cases, a dead man's only wound was a gaping hole in the top of his skull. It was a bloodbath, the worst thing any of Dry Gulch's men had ever seen. And they had lived through half a dozen Rocky Mountain winters, 2 bear attacks, and even an attack by a gang of outlaws. They had seen things in their time, driving their wagons out east and living up in those mountains, but nothing like what they saw in that mine that day. Miners were dying simply because they could not get help fast enough. The men would carry someone out, and he would seem in pain but otherwise fine. Then, when they returned to him after tending to those who were more severely wounded, the man had bled to death. It was awful, but the killing was not over. Not yet. As the men were clearing out the wounded, they had to go deeper and deeper into the mine. And then, at one point, the son of the town butcher went running down into the mine to go get some help. But he never came back. And when his father went down to look for him, he found the boy with a pickaxe in his hands, hacking up corpses so furiously that he was completely covered in their blood. His father tried to stop him, but the boy attacked him. And no matter how hard his father tried, the boy would not stop. And in the end, the butcher had to put his own son down to keep him from hurting anyone else. And then he came out of that mine, screaming, broken, and insane with grief. And that was when they made the decision to seal the place up. And after gathering as much dynamite as they could, the walking wounded were able to blow the entrance and bury both the dead and the wounded alike. There were rumors that seeing all that death drove the boy insane, that his mind simply could not handle it, and that it slipped away as he walked among the dead with the coppery stink of fresh blood hanging in the air. But those who were there say there was something down there, maybe some kind of gas or fungal spore, that was to blame for making some of the miners turn on their comrades. It happened to the butcher's boy, and the butcher himself got a dose when he went down there to look for his son, because all he could do was scream and cry and struggle as his friends and family tried to keep him still. He was not just out of his mind with grief. There was something else affecting him, something the survivors thought it was best to bury. Walt Harker said the mining company paid to have all the bodies collected in return, but they fired the survivors and tried to put them in prison for blowing the mine sky high. The company thought they got everybody's body off that mountainside, but Walt Harker said he knew of people who had found bones in the woods below the mine. Not animal bones either, human bones. He even asked if we wanted to go look for ourselves, because there was a slim chance we might find a souvenir, as he put it. But we told him we were good and had seen all we needed to. If there was anywhere on Earth that was genuinely haunted, it was that old mining town. And we did not want any of those old ghosts putting a curse on our tour, because we had been dumb enough to walk off with some of those bones. And Walt Harker laughed at that. And we did too. But it was not entirely a joke. Not in my case, anyway. We called it quits not long after. And then we were back on the road, headed for Aspen. We had Lake City and Dry Gulch in our rear view, but Walt Harker's story stayed with me for the rest of the tour. It stayed with me so much that when we got back home, I rented a book from the East Coast City Library about mining disasters. Now, it was obviously a terrifying read, and I learned that there's a gas called hydrogen sulfide, something miners used to call stink damp, which is known to have a narcotic effect in certain doses. It is possible that the men at the mine's deepest point were suddenly exposed to high levels of the stink damp, at which point they lost their minds. And the rest of the massacre could possibly be explained by a kind of herd mentality, or collective panic, where confused and frightened men were gripped by a primal kill or be killed instinct. But the thing I've never been able to figure out is why the guards turned on each other too. Walt Harker said it appeared as if the company guards, the ones who'd been off-duty and stationed in town, had begun attacking each other during the final stages of the massacre. And to me, that suggests something other than narcotic gases were to blame for what had happened. I've often wondered what the real cause was, but there also comes a point where I tell myself to stop thinking about it, because the things my imagination starts to dream up can really begin to frighten me. Years later, I learned that some places don't just haunt memories, they leave evidence. One morning, way back in fall of the late 2000s, a retired day hiker was trekking up the North Lateral Marine Trail when he came across a shallow karst cave system just off the beaten path. He claimed to have an interest in what he called pioneer relics, things like rusted tin cans and shattered crockery left behind by the old covered wagons that used to snake through the Front Range. And so he made a habit of shining his flashlight into the darkness and looking around for old artifacts. But what he found that day was no antique. He found bones, human bones, and said they were scattered around the cave floor and looked old, bleached, and white. And he thought they were just animal bones at first. But then he found the skull. He told the dispatcher that he realized it was a skeleton, maybe one left over from the early pioneer tragedy, or at least some other tragedy of the same type of situation. And he said they looked 100 years old. But he was wrong. And the person who proved him wrong was me. Whenever anyone finds human remains and they're not fresh, medical examiners like me get a call. And it's our job to head out to wherever the remains are found and give our expert opinion on how and why their owner passed away. Most of the time, we simply drive to the location of the remains and then head back to the office once we're done. But on this occasion, since the remains were found way up in the Rockies, we were flying in by helicopter. We arrived around midday. Myself, a tech from the State Forensic Bureau lab in Northern Plains City, a photographer from the coroner's office, and a couple of rangers from the Park Service to keep the area secure. It took a while, but we eventually found the cave the hiker had referred to, which was really more like a crack in the granite. And then we suited up in Tyvek, those white suits you see on CSI, flicked on our headlamps, and entered the cave to lay out the 10 by 10 meter baseline. Now, what struck me initially was that the remains were partial, meaning it wasn't a complete skeleton. We found things like a detached mandible, fragments of a radius and ulna pair, and a scattering of phalanges and thoracic vertebrae. But there was no pelvis, and there were no long bones below the femora, the thigh bones, which were also entirely absent. Now, the hiker was right about the bones, to an extent, because they appeared to have been there for a very long time. Under the light of my LED beams, I could see the cortical bone was marred by fine vertical striations, which suggested decades of exposure to freezing winds. But then, the more I looked at it, the more something started to nag at me. When we found the skull, I took a good long look at it. I was searching for gnaw marks from rodents or other tooth marks, what we call carnivore pitting from large predators. But there was nothing, just uniform periosteal stripping that was far too clean to be weather damage. And that left only one plausible explanation. The flesh had been cut away from the bone by something very sharp. Now, I bagged a sample right there. A shard of bone used for our preliminary histology, which is the fancy term for putting something under a microscope. And once we set up a mobile unit at the trailhead, we ran the sample through the portable FTIR spectrometer and watched it light up like a flare. There was a high amount of hydroxyapatite crystallinity, but the sample also showed some unusual thermal degradation signatures, which told me it had been exposed to sublethal heating at a temperature of around 170 to 220 degrees Fahrenheit. There was no charring, and what we were seeing wasn't any kind of normal diagenesis or decomposition. And that left only one feasible explanation. The bones had been boiled. After returning to the cave and continuing our analysis, more pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. We found a well-used enameled iron cooking pot at the rear of the cave. Traces of bone marrow residue clung to its interior, with lipid profiles consistent with the same kind that comes from human femurs. High in oleic acid, low in polyunsaturated fats. The discovery of more bones proved that the defiling had been anything but crude scavenging. It had been methodical. There were parallel incision marks on the ends of the bones, and judging by the microstriations, they'd been inflicted by some kind of carbon steel filleting knife, most likely with a serrated edge. And to the best of my judgment, I'd have to say the flesh had been removed immediately after death, before the bones were simmered to make a broth of tenderized marrow. There would be no logical reason to do this other than consumption, in which case it made sense that the lower limbs were missing, as the meatiest cuts had most likely been hauled away for later. Now, in plain English, this wasn't the kind of survival cannibalism people were forced into on the Oregon Trail. It had been staged in isolation, most likely to evade the prying eyes of rangers and hikers. This was desperation. This was a feast. We had the remains airlifted to the Front Range City Lab that afternoon, where a full post-mortem unfolded over the course of several weeks. Now, it took a while, but we later heard the carbon dating on the sample we took pegged the year of death between 2003 and 2005. There were no corresponding dental records for the teeth that remained in the skull. The molars showed moderate damage, but there were no fillings or orthodontic work done. So, my best guess was that he'd been some kind of vagrant. Now, we extracted some degraded DNA and ran it through the state's database, as well as CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system. And we got 0 hits. There were no familial matches, no cold case crossovers, nothing at all. As for where the victim was from, enamel analysis pointed toward a Midwestern upbringing. But contrary to my theory that this person was a vagrant, the only thing that showed up in the toxicology reports was trace caffeine metabolites. There was no sign of a struggle, no restraint marks on the wrists. Cause of death was most likely asphyxiation or blunt force trauma. He was killed elsewhere, then transported to the karst cave for what I suppose you could call the harvest. The case files have been archived for more than 6 years now, collecting digital dust in the State Bureau of Investigation's unsolved ledger. The killer, most likely male given the brute force required to do what he did, cleanly slipped the noose, so to speak, meaning that somewhere out there in the sprawl of flyover country, or maybe in some small mountain town, there is a murderer and a cannibal breathing free air. I used to picture it sometimes, his pot simmering with bone broth as he packaged up the better cuts. I can't forget it, and I know I never will, because in this line of work, some fractures never heal.